We often think of glass as a human invention, some eureka moment in history. The truth is far more complicated. Hundreds of thousands of years before any civilization existed, nature had already made glass through volcanoes, and humans, the first hunter-gatherers, found it lying on the ground, razor-sharp and darkly gleaming. It was the beginning of a story spanning hundreds of thousands of years, a story of accidents, legends, luxury, and ultimately, a catastrophe that transformed humans themselves into the very material their ancestors once revered. When did humans first encounter glass? The answer will surprise most people. Not 5,000 years ago, not 10,000 years ago. It may have been more than 700,000 years ago. It was obsidian, volcanic glass, formed when silica-rich lava cooled too quickly to crystallize into ordinary rock. Chemically, it is remarkably similar to the glass humans would later make by melting sand. But Stone Age humans did not care about chemistry. They cared about one strange property of obsidian. When fractured, it did not break apart randomly. It fractured along smooth, shell-like curves, what archaeologists call a conchoidal fracture, producing edges sharper than those of almost any other stone on Earth. Humans did not invent glass first. They used glass, making knives, spearheads, and tools for butchering prey, hundreds of thousands of years before they knew how to make it themselves. But if obsidian is so sharp, why don't we still use it? The answer may make you look at the modern operating room differently. Some doctors today still use obsidian scalpels, because under an electron microscope, even the finest surgical steel blades have tiny serrations. Obsidian does not. It can be sharper than steel, and it does not leave metal fragments in a wound. Aztec warriors once attached obsidian blades to wooden clubs. According to Spanish accounts, the weapon was sharp enough to decapitate a horse. But that was only the first chapter. Because for hundreds of thousands of years, humans had only found glass. They did not yet know how to make it. So what caused humans to create artificial glass for the first time? Around 3,500 to 2,500 BC, in Mesopotamia and Syria, small opaque beads of jewelry began appearing in graves. They were the earliest known examples of man-made glass, but there is a strange detail. Almost certainly, no one intended to make it. Archaeologists believe the first glass was an accidental byproduct, perhaps from a metalworking furnace or possibly from firing a material called faience, a shimmering glazed substance that the Egyptians called jianeh, meaning brilliance. Someone, somewhere, allowed the temperature to rise higher than expected. Sand, ash, and minerals melted into a thick liquid, then cooled into a material that had never existed before. One of the most important materials in human history may have been born from a mistake. But if it was merely an accident in Mesopotamia, why were Egyptians hundreds of miles to the south also making the same thing at almost exactly the same time? This is where the story becomes more complicated than archaeologists would like. For nearly a century, scholars believed Mesopotamia was the birthplace of glass, based on artifacts excavated at a site called Nuzi in modern-day Iraq. But in 2016, at an archaeological conference in San Antonio, two researchers, Catherine Ehreman of the Harvard Art Museums and Andrew Shortland of Cranfield University's Southwest, announced findings that challenged that theory. When they reanalyzed the Nuzi glass, they discovered that it was much younger than previously thought and far more crudely made than Egyptian glass from the same period. In other words, Mesopotamia may not have been the first. They may simply have been copying. And then there was an even stranger detail. When scientists analyzed the chemical composition of the earliest glass from both regions, the formulas were almost identical. Yet to this day, no one has ever found a piece of Egyptian glass in Mesopotamia, or vice versa. How could two civilizations hundreds of miles apart have produced the same formula without exchanging the finished products? The strongest theory today is not about who invented it first, but something more subtle. Perhaps craftsmen traveled, carrying knowledge rather than goods. Technology spread. The objects did not. It remains an archaeological paradox with no definitive answer. But wherever glass began, one thing is certain. For more than 1,000 years afterward, it was anything but ordinary. Imagine you are an Egyptian living under Pharaoh Thutmose III. around 1450 BC. To you, glass is not a bottle for holding water. It is as valuable as a gemstone. The only technique for making a hollow glass vessel at the time was called core forming. The craftsman had to wrap molten glass around a core made from sand mixed with animal dung, shape it by hand, and then scrape the core out after the glass cooled. There were no blowpipes, no molds. Each object required hours of painstaking work. As a result, glass became a royal luxury. Multicolored vessels and pendants inlaid with red, gold, green, and blue have been found at royal sites from the time of Thutmose III. For more than 1,000 years, glass was something only the elite could afford to touch. So what transformed it within just a few centuries into something cheap enough for ordinary Romans to buy at the market? Around 50 BC, in a small coastal region of Syria, Phoenicia, something happened that permanently changed the way people lived inside their homes. Craftsmen there were still using the core forming technique, wrapping glass around a metal rod that held the sand core. But according to archaeologists, that very rod may at some point have been hollowed out, and someone, perhaps by accident, blew air through it. The first glass bubble in human history was born. At the site of Tel Anifa, archaeologists have found some of the earliest known blown glass bottles, direct evidence of this technological turning point. Within just a few decades, glassblowing spread throughout the expanding Roman Empire. An object once valued like a gemstone could now be produced in minutes instead of hours. For the first time in history, glass became something an ordinary person could own. But much of what you have heard about how glass was born is probably wrong. There is a story that has been repeated for 2,000 years. Phoenician merchants stopped on a beach and used blocks of saltstone to support their cooking fire, and the fire became hot enough to melt the sand into glass. That is the story told by the Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder. The problem is that almost the entire modern archaeological community rejects it. As early as 1933, archaeologist D.B. Hardin of the Ashmolean Museum described the story as implausible, both technically and chronologically, simply because an outdoor campfire could never reach temperatures high enough to melt sand into glass. And glass, as we have just seen, already existed more than 1,500 years before the Phoenicians began their maritime trade. Even Pliny did not completely trust his own story. He wrote that it was more widely circulated than verified. But Pliny told another story, a far stranger one, and this time, the price was a human life. According to a legend recorded in Roman texts by Pliny, Petronius, and Cassius Dio, a glassmaker invented something called vitrum flexile, flexible glass that could never break. Throw it onto the ground and it would simply dent like soft metal, then could be hammered back into shape. The craftsman brought his invention before Emperor Tiberius, expecting a reward. Instead, according to the legend, Tiberius ordered him executed, fearing that unbreakable glass would cause gold and silver to lose their value. This was almost certainly a Roman urban legend. There is no archaeological evidence that flexible glass ever existed, only a few written accounts with no physical artifact. But the story survives for a reason. It reflects exactly how the Romans viewed glass, a material so extraordinary that it could threaten the empire's entire economic order. But if glass had become so widespread under the Romans, why did houses not begin having glass windows until nearly 100 AD? Here is a fact that surprises most people. Glass windows, something we take for granted in every modern home, only appeared around 100 AD. And even then, they were not for ordinary homes. The earliest Roman window glass fragments have been found in the volcanic ash of Pompeii and Herculaneum, thick and opaque, used mainly in public baths because glass helped retain heat in the steam rooms. Ordinary homes still used wooden shutters, leather curtains, or, for those wealthy enough, thin, translucent sheets of mica or gypsum. That means thousands of years of human civilization passed without a single glass window. And those rare pieces of window glass, buried in the same catastrophe, will take us back to where the story began. The year was 79 AD. Mount Vesuvius erupted. Pompeii and Herculaneum, the two towns where some of the oldest Roman window glass was found, were buried within hours. And Pliny the Elder himself, the man who recorded both the Phoenician beach story and the legend of flexible glass, died in that very catastrophe while attempting to rescue people by sea. But that was not the strangest thing Vesuvius left behind. A study published in 2025 revealed something never before documented. At Herculaneum, scientists found the remains of a victim whose brain tissue had partially transformed into a glass-like material, the first known case of natural vitrification occurring in a human. For that to happen, the temperature had to rise extremely rapidly, and then cool just as rapidly, much like the volcanic lava that, hundreds of thousands of years ago, cooled to create the first glossy black stone our ancestors ever held. Obsidian. The material that began our story, volcanic glass formed by extreme temperatures, now closes it with humans themselves, transformed by the same physical mechanism. And that forces us to revisit an assumption that seemed settled for nearly a century. For nearly 100 years, scientists believed that obsidian formed when lava cooled extremely rapidly, almost instantaneously. But a geological study published in Nature Communications in 2025 challenged that idea. Obsidian actually requires a much slower cooling process than previously thought in order to preserve its characteristic amorphous structure. Even the first material humans ever held, something we thought we understood after centuries of research, still contains secrets that modern science is only beginning to unravel. And if even obsidian still hides surprises, perhaps it is no wonder that an entire glass industry once disappeared, without anyone knowing exactly why. Around 1250 BC, the flourishing glass industry of the Near East, which had thrived under Thutmose III just 200 years earlier, almost completely disappeared. The timing coincided with one of archaeology's greatest mysteries, the collapse of the Bronze Age, when a series of Mediterranean and Near Eastern civilizations collapsed almost simultaneously for reasons that remain debated to this day: drought, warfare, or the breakdown of trade networks. No one knows for certain why glassmaking disappeared alongside that collapse, but it demonstrates one thing. Even one of the most important technologies in human history can disappear within a single generation if the world around it collapses. It would take more than another 1,000 years, and the development of the glass-blowing pipe, for glass to return, and this time, it would never disappear again. From a volcanic stone lying by chance on the ground, to an accident inside a Mesopotamian furnace, to a hollowed-out metal rod in the hands of an unknown Syrian craftsman, glass was never truly invented. It was discovered, again and again, by people who had no idea they were creating one of the materials that would shape civilization itself. From the windows in your home, to the lens in the phone you're holding, to the fiber optic cable carrying this very video to you. And then, on a morning in 79 AD, humans themselves, not sand, not stone, became glass. If a material can travel from a Stone Age weapon to a royal treasure to the most ordinary object in your home, and finally, in one horrifying moment, into the human body itself, then the real question is not how glass has changed. The question is, how many more chapters of this story remain undiscovered, lying silently in wait to be found?